On the 19th of December, humanity might survive by nothing more than an accident of probability. There is a version of events where we wake up the next morning and everything continues as usual, and there is another version where we do not wake up at all. The difference between those outcomes is not preparation, not technology, and not some heroic last-minute intervention. It is luck. Cold, impersonal statistical luck. And the reason this sounds terrifying is because our future is suddenly tied to an object that should never have come this close to us, moving in a way that no natural body should, and ignoring every model we use to understand the sky. The story began quietly, without drama, without sirens, without any cinematic build-up. A small set of numbers appeared wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, just wrong enough for the people reading them to stop mid-sentence. At first, everyone tried to blame the usual suspects: thermal drift in a sensor, a calibration error, a software glitch introduced by a routine update. But the more corrections the system applied, the more obvious it became that the numbers were not trying to hide a mistake. They were revealing a truth that nobody was prepared for. An object was approaching on a trajectory that had no business existing in our part of the solar system. It moved with a precision that was deeply unsettling, threading through gravitational fields the way a needle passes through fabric, smoothly, deliberately, without deviation. No tumbling, no shedding of mass, no thermal anomalies, no radiation bursts, just silent, calculated movement, as if it had already solved all the physics in its path long before we ever noticed it. This alone wasn't enough to trigger global alerts, but it was enough to make researchers sit up straighter and go very still. Scientific silence is rarely peaceful. It is the type of silence that means something is wrong in a way nobody knows how to articulate yet, because the words haven't been invented for it. When the first images came in, things did not become clearer. There were no glowing symbols, no mechanical structures, nothing that screamed artificial. It looked like a natural object. But it behaved like something that wasn't bound by natural randomness. For interstellar debris, irregularity is the rule, chaos is the rule. This object followed neither. It held a straight line with fidelity that spacecraft engineers would envy, ignoring perturbations that should have nudged it even slightly off course. And that is when the probability chart started to shift into uncomfortable territory. Trajectory models do not jump unless forced to, yet overnight the impact probability curve lifted from negligible to not impossible, and then from not impossible to statistically noticeable. Even the most conservative estimates placed a non-zero risk on a near-Earth passage tight enough that a small deviation, just fractions of a degree, could turn survivability into a matter of whether random forces decided to favour us or eliminate us. Humanity has survived many things, but never before has its fate hinged so delicately on the mathematical equivalent of a coin toss. Governments asked for briefings, agencies requested additional verification. Research groups repeated measurements obsessively, hoping to find anything that would make the numbers behave more politely. None of it helped. The data remained consistent, and consistency is the one thing you never want from an anomaly. Public statements tried to calm people down with the usual phrases about ongoing monitoring and no immediate danger. But behind closed doors, analysts compared this event to everything in recorded astronomical history, and nothing matched. Every known interstellar visitor, Oumuamua, Borisov, the fragments catalogued across decades showed signs of natural origin: irregular spin, asymmetric outgassing, structural instability. Atlas had none of these features. It was too stable, too clean, too efficient. And at a certain point, the absence of natural signatures becomes its own kind of evidence. But let's not romanticize this. Nobody wanted to jump straight to dramatic conclusions. Scientists don't like panic. They prefer models, graphs, equations, anything that gives them the illusion of control. Yet the deeper they dug into the data, the clearer it became that control was the one thing nobody had. If the object continued along its projected line, December 19th became a date of interest not because doom was guaranteed, but because doom was at least mathematically available. When a possibility rises from 0 to greater than 0, the psychological impact is immediate. People begin to imagine outcomes. They calculate where their families would be. They refresh news feeds that still pretend nothing unusual is happening. And in the scientific community, a different kind of fear appears. The fear of being right too early. Because once a prediction becomes public, you carry responsibility for whatever people do with that information. The strangest part in all this is that the object did not announce itself. It didn't flash signals or release energy or behave aggressively. It simply existed in a way that forced us to reconsider what we think we know about celestial dynamics. Its silence became threatening not because silence is hostile, but because silence leaves too much room for interpretation. A chaotic asteroid behaves like a chaotic asteroid. A stable interstellar object moving with unnatural precision behaves like a question humanity is not prepared to answer. And here we arrive at the core problem. We're not in danger because the object wants anything. We're in danger because the universe occasionally throws events at us that care nothing about our level of readiness. Whether we survive or not hinges on variables that cannot be negotiated with. No technology can adjust them. No committee can vote them away. December 19th will arrive whether we understand the object or remain terrified of it. For now, all we have is the narrow comfort that survival is still on the table. Yes, the situation is unnerving. Yes, analysts would prefer more time and more data. Yes, there are many unanswered questions, and some of those questions point to possibilities we don't like to consider. But if the object maintains its current trajectory without deviation, there is a genuine chance that everything resolves harmlessly. A chance, not a guarantee. And in the following chapters, we will walk step by step through how this situation became what it is, why the scientific world is far less confident than public statements suggest, and how a chain of small discoveries slowly built into a reality where humanity must quietly accept that its survival might depend not on intelligence, strength, or preparation, but on whether physics decides to be kind to us this month. The strangest part about events like this is how quickly professionals try to pretend everything is fine. You would think that astronomers, of all people, would appreciate honesty when the sky begins acting strange, but no. The first instinct is always to lower their voices, stare at instruments as if intimidation works on physics, and ask one painfully timid question. Are you sure that's the correct reading? It never is, of course. Not because the reading is wrong, but because accepting it means accepting that something larger than your entire field of study just walked into the room uninvited. And since astrophysics isn't famous for spontaneous plot twists, this situation left even experienced researchers blinking at their monitors longer than usual. Once the initial shock wore off, teams began running standard procedures, cross-checking observations from other observatories, recalculating everything from luminosity drift to solar wind interference. Normally, these steps either resolve the anomaly or reveal that someone had left a protective cap on a sensor. But this time, each verification only made the object look more real and more improbable. The odds of such a trajectory forming naturally were so low that one analyst muttered that they might as well start calculating the probability of a coin landing on its edge for 10 flips in a row. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't supposed to be. As more data came in, the tone shifted from confusion to something worse. A growing number of researchers quietly agreed that the object's behavior didn't match any known category. It wasn't tumbling like comets do. It wasn't shedding fragments. It wasn't reacting to solar radiation in the expected way. Instead, it maintained a stability that felt almost designed, as if it followed instructions written somewhere far beyond human comprehension. But since nobody wanted to be the first to suggest that out loud, the conversations became painfully diplomatic. Words like non-standard, unexpected, and under review replaced the actual thoughts running through their heads. Nobody wants to be the scientist quoted in history books as the first one who said, "I think this thing is not behaving like a rock." Still, even the most cautious language couldn't hide the obvious tension. Something was wrong. And when something is wrong in space, the consequences usually happen at speeds and scales that don't leave much time for philosophical reflection. That's why agencies began reviewing older data, looking for any hint that this object had been overlooked earlier. If it had entered the solar system unnoticed, that alone was a red flag. Thankfully, or perhaps alarmingly, the trail was clean. No previous detection, no warning. It had appeared in our instruments exactly when the anomaly began. Not before, not gradually. Just there one moment, not there the moment before. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. Either the object was too faint to detect until recently, which would make its sudden clarity suspicious, or it behaved in a way that avoided detection entirely, which would raise questions nobody wanted to touch. The narrative that we simply missed it held for about 11 minutes before collapsing under its own weight. The data did not support oversight. The object was simply new, freshly arrived, freshly visible, freshly threatening. As more institutions became aware of the situation, subtle pressure began to form at the edges of the scientific community. Agencies wanted answers quickly, but nobody could provide them. The object wasn't bright enough to give clear surface details, and it wasn't large enough to generate measurable gravitational effects. It just slid through the darkness like a piece of information someone forgot to attach context to. So researchers did what researchers always do when backed into a corner. They invented more context. Some said it was a shard of an ancient comet. others suggested it could be a chunk of interstellar debris pushed by forces beyond our modelling ability. A few dared to whisper that its coherence resembled controlled behaviour, and then they immediately said, "But we're not claiming anything, of course." Meanwhile, the real problem was getting worse. Orbital models showed that the trajectory was gradual but precise, a line drawn with infuriating confidence. A natural object should wobble, it should drift, it should react to perturbations. This one navigated the solar system like it had access to a map we had never seen. And as it approached the region where gravitational interactions grow more complicated, it continued unhindered, as if anticipating every shift in the environment before the shifts even occurred. Observers began to notice small inconsistencies that hinted at something more. The object's predicted position would be off by fractions, but the real position always corrected the model instead of the model correcting the real position. It was as if the object knew where it should be, even when calculations disagreed. Again, this doesn't prove anything, but when you're dealing with interstellar phenomena, the line between coincidence and intention becomes dangerously thin. Now, here is where the human part of the story intrudes. People in general do not respond well to uncertainty, and the idea that something unfamiliar is moving toward us with precision is exactly the kind of uncertainty the human mind dislikes. Scientists attempted to keep everything quiet for as long as they could, hoping the anomaly would resolve itself the way many strange space events eventually do. But when the calculations began showing a non-negligible probability that the object could pass close enough to Earth to affect us in ways nobody wanted to list publicly, silence stopped being an option. Even then, the choice wasn't between telling the truth and lying. The choice was between minimizing panic and minimizing ignorance. And as usual, the public statements leaned heavily toward minimizing panic. That's why official press releases sounded almost cheerful compared to the internal briefings. But behind the scenes, the tone was painfully serious. Analysts were no longer asking whether the object posed a theoretical risk. They were asking how small a deviation it would take for theoretical risk to become immediate consequence. This is where the 19th of December enters the narrative again. Not because it represents certain doom, but because it genuinely sits on the statistical knife edge of possibility. If the object's path shifts ever so slightly toward us, then we face a scenario with consequences severe enough that nobody wants to describe them plainly. Yet if the path shifts the other direction by the same margin, we simply get a close pass, a scientific mystery, and a generation of memes about how humanity got lucky again. The fragility of this outcome is almost surreal. Imagine standing in a field while a bullet flies past your ear and being told afterward that the shot wasn't aimed at you, but you were standing in precisely the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. No malice, no warning, no grand event, just statistics playing with your life. That is the emotional landscape scientists are navigating right now. The numbers say we might survive easily. The same numbers say we might not. And neither answer comes with enough certainty to be comforting. The fact that everything depends on a margin of error smaller than the width of a human hair does not inspire confidence. But the truth is the truth. We might get out of this entirely unharmed, and we might not. The universe seldom explains itself. All we can do is watch, measure, recalculate, and pretend that humans are emotionally prepared for situations where luck outweighs logic. The next stages of this story won't calm anyone down, but they will explain how we reached a point where the scientific community quietly braced itself for outcomes far outside routine astrophysics. And if you think the first 2 chapters are unsettling, wait until you see what happens when scientists begin to analyze not just the object's trajectory, but the growing social turbulence around it. Because the moment people learned something unusual was heading our way, humanity did exactly what humanity always does. It broke into camps, argued, panicked, joked, denied everything, and created more noise than clarity. But that, my friend, is where we're heading next. Something strange happens to society the moment even a whisper of cosmic uncertainty reaches it. You'd expect panic to explode instantly, alarms blaring, people running in circles, dramatic speeches on television. But no, the first wave is always denial. A calm, confident, entirely fictional sense of control. People post memes. They argue about completely unrelated things. Influencers pretend nothing is happening because it might ruin their posting schedule. Governments issue the classic "there is no reason for concern" statement, which historically means the exact opposite. And through all this cheerful noise, something darker begins forming beneath the surface, a kind of collective unease that nobody wants to acknowledge, because acknowledging it makes it real. Once news of the object leaked beyond the scientific circles, the atmosphere shifted in ways that data scientists could measure before psychologists even commented. Search queries spiked, social feeds filled with speculation. Everyone suddenly became an amateur astrophysicist armed with enthusiasm and absolutely no understanding of orbital mechanics. That would be amusing if it weren't so predictable. Humans respond to fear not with silence, but with oversharing. It's as if talking loudly about something terrifying makes it less capable of hurting you. Unfortunately, the universe does not adjust itself according to how many TikTok videos mention a potential existential threat. As the story spread, The emotional climate fractured quickly. Some people dismissed the anomaly as hype, insisting that scientists exaggerate for funding. Others embraced the opposite extreme and immediately assumed the worst-case scenario, turning every minor update into proof that the sky was falling. And in the middle sat the vast majority curious, uneasy, pretending not to be worried, but checking updates more often than necessary. This collective behavior created a feedback loop of anxiety and misinformation. The more uncertain the data became, the more emotional people grew, and the more emotional people grew, the harder it became to maintain any rational conversation about what was actually happening. Meanwhile, researchers monitoring social patterns began noticing something scientifically alarming. Human behavior during cosmic uncertainty follows predictable phases. At first, people search for reassurance, then they search for explanations, then they search for someone to blame. And after that, the situation tends to spiral into chaos because everyone starts reacting to everyone else instead of reacting to reality. Social networks amplify these phases by treating emotional spikes as valuable content, pushing fear to the top of feeds because fear increases engagement. And engagement, unfortunately, is the currency of the modern world. As the object approached, its trajectory updates didn't just influence astronomers, they influenced millions of people who were never supposed to interpret this kind of information. Statistical curves that were meant for specialists became screenshots shared online, stripped of context and treated as prophecy. Suddenly, probability lines were misread as countdowns. Models were interpreted as predictions. Minor adjustments became proof that something catastrophic was guaranteed. And while scientists tried to explain that uncertainty does not equal doom, their calm reasoning was drowned out by a rising tide of opinionated panic merchants. This would all be merely amusing if it didn't have real consequences. Social behavior affects infrastructure. When enough people believe something terrifying is imminent, they begin acting in ways that strain systems not designed for emotionally driven surges. Panic buying, financial volatility, overloaded communication lines, hospitals receiving calls from people who misinterpreted a headline, emergency services struggling to manage a crisis that doesn't technically exist yet. The threat becomes psychological long before it becomes physical. The most ironic part is that scientists had anticipated some level of turbulence, but even they were caught off guard by the scale. The data they initially shared with the public was filtered, simplified, carefully framed to avoid unnecessary stress. Yet the simplified version caused more stress than the detailed version ever would have. This is the paradox of crisis communication. The truth can be unsettling, but half-truths are worse, because the gaps get filled by imagination, and imagination has no safety protocols. As the days passed, the social climate grew increasingly unstable. People didn't know whether to panic or relax, so they did both simultaneously, oscillating between doom scrolling and denial like some sort of emotional pendulum. Every news outlet had its own narrative. Every influencer had its own interpretation. Every conspiracy forum had 100 explanations ranging from plausible miscommunications to theories involving alien surveillance networks, planetary resets, and secret agreements between world governments and something in space. The problem wasn't that people speculated. The problem was that speculation began to overshadow the facts, and the facts were unsettling enough without exaggeration. The object continued closing in. Its path remained unnaturally precise, and the probability charts remained stubbornly undecided about our fate. This uncertainty seeped into the collective consciousness, amplifying every emotional response. People began projecting their personal fears onto the situation. Some saw it as punishment, others as opportunity. Some considered it a warning. Others imagined it as a cleansing event that would reset civilizations. The object became a mirror reflecting the anxieties of an entire species. Scientists monitoring these behavioral trends found themselves studying not just the anomaly in the sky, but the anomaly on Earth. The way information cascaded through society in unpredictable cascading waves. They observed that fear spread faster than facts, rumors spread faster than updates, and emotional spikes traveled across networks like shockwaves. Human communication systems were never built to handle global existential fear in real time, yet that is precisely what they were forced to endure. And just when it seemed like the situation had reached peak irrationality, a new layer of complexity appeared. The object's behavior remained calm and consistent while humanity's behavior became erratic and unstable. This contrast highlighted something that made researchers deeply uncomfortable. The threat wasn't only cosmic, it was psychological. Humanity was destabilizing itself in anticipation of a danger that might not even manifest. The mere possibility of catastrophe was enough to trigger cascading stress across nations. This revealed a truth nobody liked admitting. The fragility wasn't in the universe, it was in us. Governments watching this unfold faced a difficult choice. If they revealed too much information, they risk escalating public anxiety beyond control. If they revealed too little, they risk being accused of hiding critical data. Both outcomes threatened social stability. So officials did what they always do under pressure. They issued polished statements designed to appear reassuring, while saying almost nothing concrete. It was a temporary solution, and everyone knew it wouldn't hold for long. Meanwhile, the online ecosystem continued mutating. Some communities treated the approaching object as entertainment, making jokes about humanity's season finale. Others treated it as a spiritual sign. Others saw it as validation of a long-standing conspiracies. But regardless of interpretation, everyone contributed to the noise. The digital world grew so loud that signal became indistinguishable from speculation. And through all this, the object continued moving with silent indifference, unaffected by the chaos unfolding below. The social turbulence mattered more than people realized. Not because it influenced the object, there was no evidence of that, but because it influenced the ability of scientists, institutions, and emergency planners to respond effectively. Decision-making became clouded by the pressure to manage public perception. Long-term planning suffered because short-term panic demanded immediate attention. And the one thing you never want during a potential cosmic threat is a civilization that destabilizes itself before the danger even arrives. This is where the 19th becomes more than a date. It becomes a psychological deadline, a point on the calendar around which humanity projects its fear, hope, denial, curiosity, and confusion. Whether the object passes harmlessly or becomes something far worse, the social impact has already begun reshaping how people interact with each other, with institutions, and with the idea of their own survival. And the coming chapters will only deepen this as we move toward the next layer of the story, the part where the human mind, unprepared and unshielded, begins reacting to the possibility that humanity might not be alone in its vulnerability. As the object continued its approach, something far less physical and far more disturbing began unfolding inside the minds of those following the story closely. There is a specific psychological reaction that humans experience when they are forced to acknowledge something existential, something too large to fit neatly into the comfort zones built by routine and daily habit. The moment the brain recognizes that an event has no precedent and no clear outcome, it tries to push the thought aside. But the thought doesn't go away. It sits there, heavy and intrusive, quietly rearranging the emotional structure behind your eyes. And soon enough, the very idea of normalcy begins to feel fragile. This is not superstition or philosophy. It is measurable. Behavioral researchers found that people were demonstrating symptoms typically associated with what they call cognitive destabilization. It happens when an entire population is exposed to information that challenges the basic expectation that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Humans are creatures of anticipation, and when anticipation breaks, the nervous system becomes unpredictable. Sleep patterns change, focus shifts, even humor develops an edge of desperation, as if jokes are the last flimsy barrier against the realization that certainty is slipping. As more data about the object circulated, this destabilization grew. People didn't need clarity to panic. They needed uncertainty, and they had plenty of that. The object's movements, probability charts, institutional silence, and conflicting interpretations all combined into a perfect storm of ambiguity. An ambiguity for the human mind is often more damaging than the truth, because the imagination fills every blank with its worst-case scenario. The object might have been harmless. It might have been a passing curiosity. But the vacuum of answers became a breeding ground for fear that spread faster than any official update could contain. Psychologists studying historical crises noticed that this reaction wasn't new. Humanity has a long history of responding poorly to invisible threats. Pandemics, radiation, unseen enemies, even rumors of cosmic danger have produced similar patterns. But this situation was unique because the threat was neither confirmed nor disproven. It hovered in a liminal space where both fear and denial flourished simultaneously. Some people clung to hope, insisting nothing would happen. Others monitored the sky obsessively, convinced the worst was inevitable. And many oscillated between these extremes, never quite settling on one emotional state for more than a few hours. Meanwhile, science continued doing what science does, accumulating data slowly, carefully, painfully. But the psychological gap widened faster than the data could fill it, and societies began exhibiting the early signs of what researchers called pre-impact cognition. This doesn't mean impact is certain. It means the human brain begins behaving as if everything is already part of a countdown. People plan differently, they interact differently, they avoid long-term commitments, or they rush into them impulsively. They become hyper-aware of news cycles, hypersensitive to vague statements, and hyper-reactive to even the smallest deviation in the narrative. This explains why conversations about the object were no longer about the object. They became discussions about mortality, control, fate, the fragility of civilization, and the uncomfortable truth that no amount of technological advancement guarantees safety in a universe that operates on scales far beyond human authority. And while all these conversations sound philosophical, they were rooted in a biological response to uncertainty. Fear is simply the body's way of warning itself that something fundamental is out of alignment. At the institutional level, the same destabilizing effect appeared just with better suits and more polished vocabulary. Government officials tried to project confidence, but confidence requires understanding, and understanding was in short supply. Behind closed doors, coordinators debated how much information could be released without amplifying public anxiety. Some argued for complete transparency, believing that truth is stabilizing. Others insisted that people collapse without managed narratives, and that too much information would cause unnecessary disruption. Ironically, both arguments were correct, and that made the decision-making process chaotic. Scientific agencies weren't immune either. Researchers found themselves second-guessing their own conclusions, not because the data was unreliable, but because the implications were too heavy. Entire careers had been built on the assumption that certain cosmic events were statistically improbable. Now those improbabilities were staring back at them through telescopes and radar tracks. It's difficult to maintain composure when the universe suddenly behaves like it missed the memo on how it is supposed to work. As the object drew nearer, the psychological tension deepened in an unexpected way. People began experiencing a phenomenon known as anticipatory displacement. Instead of fearing impact directly, they feared the idea of fear. They became terrified of losing control, terrified of making the wrong decisions, terrified of trusting or not trusting the information provided. Fear became self-sustaining. Even if the object vanished from the sky in that moment, the emotional echo would have stayed behind. There were also subtle but measurable changes in social interactions. Conversations grew shorter, sharper, more emotionally charged. Digital communication turned into a mix of dark humor and obsessive speculation. Even people who publicly dismissed the situation found themselves checking updates late at night, scrolling through threads they pretended not to care about. The collective subconscious was already bracing for something none of us could define yet. This is the point where the psychological layer began merging with the scientific one. As the mind destabilizes, it becomes more susceptible to misinterpreting information. Every update feels louder. Every anomaly feels significant. Every rumor feels like revelation. It creates an environment where speculation spreads faster than fact, where uncertainty becomes contagious, and where emotional reactions influence interpretations of data long before the data itself is properly analyzed. And here's the darkest part. Scientists began noticing that their own judgment was being affected too. The more they studied public panic, the more they felt the edges of it creeping into their own professionalism. Some researchers became hyper-cautious, refusing to make statements until absolutely forced. Others became overconfident, trying to counterbalance the growing fear by downplaying uncertainties. The result was a field divided between silence and forced optimism, neither of which served the truth. This blending of psychological and scientific stress created a strange cultural moment. Humanity was united not by knowledge, but by discomfort. Everyone felt the same weight pressing down, even if they avoided discussing it openly, and that weight changed behavior subtly but systematically. Productivity decreased, focus weakened, the value of routine diminished. People stopped planning vacations, long-term projects, or even mundane tasks. Life shifted into a waiting mode. All of this was happening from nothing more than a trajectory line on a screen. A trajectory line that might in the end pass safely by Earth without harming anyone. Yet its mere possibility triggered a psychological unraveling that exposed just how fragile human certainty truly is. The real irony, the part nobody wants to admit, is that humanity isn't scared of dying. Not really. Humanity is scared of not knowing. Death is a conclusion. Uncertainty is an endless sentence. And the object in the sky had placed us in the longest, most uncomfortable coma our species had ever experienced. In the next part of the story, the crisis shifts from emotional to institutional, because once the psychological cracks begin forming at the individual level, the structures built to manage crises start showing signs of strain. And if you think human unpredictability is dangerous, wait until you see what happens when governments, agencies, and global systems are forced to operate under cosmic ambiguity. As the psychological strain deepened across the population, something equally troubling began unfolding within the institutions meant to stabilize society during crises. People often imagine governments as monolithic entities full of certainty and authority, but in reality, most officials experience the same confusion and fear as everyone else, only with better lighting and more microphones. When confronted with a cosmic unknown capable of altering the future in ways no protocol accounts for, the first reaction in most governments wasn't strategic analysis. It was hesitation. A slow, cautious, bureaucratic paralysis disguised as calm professionalism. Inside those conference rooms, behind carefully worded press releases, the conversations were nowhere near as soothing as the public statement suggested. Officials debated continuously about how to manage the narrative without causing unnecessary alarm. The problem was that nobody could agree on where information ended and unnecessary alarm began. Some argued that transparency was the only path to public trust. Others insisted that full transparency would collapse that trust instantly, because people tend to react poorly when told that their survival may depend on variables outside the control of any human institution. It created an environment where decisions were guided less by facts and more by emotional calculations. What made this especially difficult was the lack of precedent. Governments have contingency plans for economic crashes, natural disasters, pandemics, and even rare space events such as large asteroid threats. But those plans require clear parameters: size, mass, velocity, impact probability. Without concrete numbers, systems built for certainty start to malfunction, and the approaching object offered nothing but uncertainty layered on top of more uncertainty. It provided no communication, no intention, no explanation. Just a trajectory and the possibility, however small, that the worst-case scenario might not be theoretical. This uncertainty put global coordination under immense stress. International agencies reached out to one another, each hoping the others had the insight or data that could reshape the narrative more favorably. Instead, they found that everyone was in the same situation, confused observers clinging to imperfect information. The truth was that the entire world was waiting for anyone to produce a clear answer. But the only thing the data revealed was that clarity wasn't coming anytime soon. Behind the scenes, scientists pressed for more detailed observations while officials tried to balance scientific urgency with political caution. Every new update led to new debates. Should they inform the public immediately? Should they wait for confirmation? Should they frame the information as unlikely but worth monitoring, or unexpected but manageable? Every option carried consequences, and nobody wanted to be responsible for choosing the wrong path. The fear of causing panic became nearly as dominant as the fear of the object itself. To make matters more complicated, several countries quietly considered implementing early protective measures despite the lack of concrete risk. Not public measures. Those would have caused panic instantly, but private logistical preparations. Discussions surfaced about satellite repositioning, hardening communication networks, securing vital archives, and even relocating key personnel. These internal steps, although precautionary, highlighted just how little confidence existed behind the facade of calm. When leaders begin quietly preparing for scenarios they publicly deny, it becomes clear that fear has infiltrated the highest levels. At the same time, scientific institutions were experiencing their own form of internal fracture. Researchers disagreed on how to interpret the data. Traditionalists insisted the object must be natural, arguing that statistical anomalies happen. But others pointed out that nothing in the object's behavior matched historical patterns. Meetings became tense as people debated the fine line between rare and impossible. Some even questioned whether the very frameworks used to classify cosmic objects needed revision. It was a rare moment where scientific humility and scientific panic collided. The uncertainty also exposed how vulnerable our civilization is to information lag. Scientists work through layers of verification, but politicians demand answers faster than the scientific method allows. Meanwhile, the public wants clarity faster than politicians can deliver. This mismatch creates a pressure system that destabilizes rational thought at every level. The result was a slow crawl toward coherence, with everyone trying to appear confident while quietly hoping the problem would resolve itself. But the object kept coming. What unsettled institutions most wasn't aggression or speed, it was the consistency. The motion remained unnervingly smooth, the trajectory unbothered by gravitational influences that should have shifted it even slightly. Every update forced agencies to confront the possibility that they weren't looking at a random interstellar visitor, but at something with qualities they had no vocabulary to describe. And admitting that openly would require acknowledging that human models are incomplete. No government wants to be the one that announces we may not understand the universe as well as we claimed. The deeper problem was communication strategy. Institutions thrive on certainty, and certainty was unavailable. So the messaging became a fragile tightrope walk. Too much reassurance risked looking dishonest. Too much honesty risked triggering mass panic. Officials found themselves practicing for every possible question, rehearsing answers designed to sound authoritative while revealing as little as possible. It was not deception out of malice. It was deception out of desperation. Meanwhile, those inside the room understood something the public did not. They weren't just making decisions about information. They were making decisions about time. If the situation worsened, there would be a window during which humanity could respond. But without knowing the object's true nature, even identifying that window was impossible. Some officials argued for releasing all data immediately, believing that an informed society could handle uncertainty better than a sheltered one. Others countered that humans often collapse under open-ended threats, and that structured communication was essential to preserve order. Every side had a point. Every side lacked certainty. As the debates continued, a new and deeply unsettling idea began circulating quietly among analysts. If the object was behaving with intention, then reassurance could do more harm than good, because it might reduce public awareness at a moment when awareness could be critical. On the other hand, announcing even the tiniest suspicion of non-natural behavior risked igniting a global panic that would tear apart the fragile cohesion society was still holding on to. This impossible dilemma created an emotional weight that nobody wanted to carry. Decision makers went home each night unable to disconnect from the knowledge that something was heading toward Earth, and that the information they chose to share or not share might determine the psychological stability of billions. It is difficult to sleep under those conditions, and many did not. Through all this internal conflict, one theme grew consistent: the realization that human systems are not built to handle unknown cosmic events. We are organized to respond to threats we understand: storms, diseases, resource shortages. But an object from beyond our star, moving with eerie precision and offering no clear explanation, falls far outside that comfort zone. Institutions began to feel their own limitations pressing in. They weren't just unprepared physically, they were unprepared conceptually. The closer the object came, the more painfully obvious this became. Humanity had entered a situation where no amount of authority could mask the truth that everyone, leaders, scientists, civilians, was waiting for the same thing, a clearer answer. And until that answer arrived, the 19th of December would remain an emotional deadline hovering over every conversation and every decision. As the next phase of the story unfolds, the tension shifts from institutional confusion to the practical, physical reality of preparation. Because once governments realize that reassurance is no longer enough, they begin confronting the possibility that some measures must be taken, not because impact is certain, but because ignoring the chance of impact is unthinkable. As the institutional debates dragged on, a different kind of urgency began growing beneath the surface, one that had nothing to do with public messaging and everything to do with physical reality. Even without a confirmed threat, the mere possibility of an object passing dangerously close to Earth forced governments and research agencies to re-evaluate their emergency protocols. These protocols were written for asteroid impacts, not for something that behaved more like a calculated visitor than a random piece of interstellar debris. Still, procedure demanded action, and action demanded clarity that simply wasn't available. So the world began preparing for something it didn't understand, hoping that preparation itself would somehow compensate for uncertainty. Scientists worked tirelessly to refine trajectory predictions, using every tool at their disposal: telescopes, radar arrays, satellite optical systems, anything capable of capturing even the slightest variation in the object's position. They were looking for reassurance, or at least for a pattern that could reduce uncertainty. But instead of clarity, the data grew more confusing. The object followed its projected path with unnerving consistency, as if intentionally minimizing the variables the models relied on. It wasn't speeding up, slowing down, or tumbling. It wasn't shedding material or reacting to solar wind. It was simply moving, a quiet, steady line cutting through the solar system with the kind of precision spacecraft engineers spend years trying to achieve. The lack of deviation wasn't comforting. It was a warning dressed as stability. Despite the ambiguity, agencies began quietly assembling task groups. They avoided calling them response teams, because that would imply a threat they were not ready to acknowledge publicly. Instead, they framed them as coordination units, a vague term meant to hide the seriousness of the situation. These groups reviewed everything from global infrastructure resilience to evacuation logistics, Even though nobody was willing to say what exactly people might need to evacuate from. It created an awkward paradox where governments were preparing for a worst-case scenario they weren't allowed to admit existed. At the same time, global observatories coordinated continuous monitoring cycles, creating a network that tracked the object nearly every minute of every day. Even minor deviations became major events. Scientists held their breath as they awaited each new update, secretly hoping for the kind of gravitational wobble that would prove the object was natural after all. But every update showed the same cold truth. The trajectory was holding. Not tightly enough to guarantee impact, but tightly enough to keep impact on the table. This tension spilled into the scientific community. Astronomers argued over the meaning of the stability. Engineers insisted that no natural object should behave like this. Physicists countered that nature is under no obligation to follow human expectations. But beneath all the polite disagreements, a shared anxiety formed an awareness that something about this approach didn't feel accidental, and the more precise the object's movement became, the harder it was to dismiss that feeling. In this atmosphere of quiet alarm, emergency planners faced their own challenges. They had to consider questions they were never trained to answer. What if the object fragmented? What if atmospheric interaction created shock waves strong enough to disrupt satellites? What if the gravitational pull alone caused unpredictable effects? What if none of that happened and the object simply passed harmlessly by, after humanity had already destabilized itself preparing for impact? Planning for uncertainty is worse than planning for danger. Danger provides direction. Uncertainty provides only stress. Different countries responded in different ways. Some increased the readiness of their space surveillance networks. Some upgraded communication lines to ensure they could handle sudden surges in traffic. A few quietly activated contingency frameworks designed for situations that fall outside typical risk categories. These frameworks weren't specifically built for cosmic anomalies, but they were flexible enough to adapt. That flexibility alone revealed the deeper truth. Even without saying it out loud, institutions understood that the object represented something far more serious than statistical chance. Meanwhile, the conversations in scientific circles shifted from "what is this object" to "what do we do if the worst happens?" Even the most skeptical researchers began accepting that not preparing was no longer an option. Nobody wanted to acknowledge the possibility of catastrophic impact, but ignoring that possibility bordered on negligence. The balancing act became a daily burden, trying to remain rational while confronting scenarios that no simulation had fully accounted for. The public, still largely unaware of the internal panic, interpreted the silence from officials as reassurance. In reality, that silence came from paralysis. Authorities didn't want to trigger global fear, but they also didn't want to be remembered as the people who underestimated the biggest threat the planet had ever faced. So they waited, they watched, they prepared quietly, and every hour that passed brought the object closer. Within the agencies, a growing realization formed. The 19th of December wasn't just a date. It was a deadline. Not for impact necessarily, but for certainty. If humanity was going to survive this, knowledge had to arrive before the object did. Information had to crystallize. Trajectories had to narrow. Probabilities had to resolve. But the universe does not run on human schedules, and the object showed no intention of making things easier. Scientists often describe celestial mechanics as elegant, predictable, and indifferent. But this object violated that elegance with its unnatural precision. It moved through gravitational fields without the minor fluctuations that natural bodies experience. Its velocity remained almost perfectly stable, despite environmental changes that should have altered it at least slightly. Even minor temperature shifts from solar exposure seemed to have no measurable effect. This lack of variation made the predictions harder, not easier, because models rely on change to determine what an object is made of, how it spins, and what forces affect it. When an object refuses to change, it refuses to reveal itself. This led to a chilling internal conclusion. Either the object was composed of material humanity had never encountered before, or it was behaving according to principles beyond current astrophysical understanding. Neither explanation offered comfort. As days passed, the preparation efforts became more pressured. Satellite operators ran tests to ensure continued function in the event of electromagnetic interference. Power grid authorities reviewed surge protocols. Emergency alert systems were checked, rechecked, and then checked again. It wasn't that anyone expected the world to end. It was that nobody wanted to be caught unprepared if the world had even a small chance of ending. Preparing didn't guarantee safety, but not preparing guaranteed regret. Throughout all this, one shared emotion threaded through the scientific and institutional landscape: the fear of being wrong. If authorities overreacted and nothing happened, they would be mocked, criticized, and blamed for wasting resources. But if they underreacted and something did happen, the consequences would be irreversible. This fear shaped decisions, delayed announcements, and created a heavy atmosphere of suppressed urgency that grew more intense every day. By this point, humanity was caught in a strange dual reality. Public life continued as normal people worked, shopped, laughed, argued, while behind the scenes, experts quietly prepared for a possibility that no one wanted to fully articulate: This disconnect created a surreal tension, as if the world was split between those who knew too little and those who knew too much. And as the 19th drew closer, the quiet preparations accelerated. Because whether the object was harmless or catastrophic, the truth would reveal itself soon, and the waiting, the endless suffocating waiting, became its own kind of threat. As the object drew closer, attention inevitably shifted toward the question nobody wanted to confront directly. What exactly was this thing made of? And what condition was it in after crossing such a hostile stretch of interstellar space? Natural bodies rarely survive journeys measured in millions of years without accumulating evidence of trauma fragmentation, erosion, chemical scars left by radiation. Yet the incoming object displayed none of the usual signs of degradation. It wasn't shedding dust, it wasn't venting gas, and it wasn't losing brightness. Its silence wasn't just behavioral, it seemed structural, as if the object had endured cosmic abuse that should have destroyed it long before entering our solar system. This raised concerns that went beyond trajectory. If the object contained organic compounds, those compounds would have been exposed to the most destructive environments possible. Cosmic rays, high-energy particles, extreme vacuum, gravitational shearing, temperatures oscillating between freezing emptiness and scorching radiation near stars. Under normal circumstances, this would sterilize anything organic to the molecular level. But normal circumstances stopped applying the moment the object behaved with more precision than any known comet or rock. Some researchers quietly proposed that if the object did contain biological material, its survival would imply protection, some form of shielding or internal compartmentalization. These suggestions were not made publicly because even hinting at the possibility of preserved organic matter inside an interstellar visitor would ignite speculation that institutions were not ready to confront. Instead, the topic was buried under technical phrasing, material resilience assumptions, unclassified composition variables, non-standard structural coherence, words designed to hide the simplicity of the fear behind them. Meanwhile, spectroscopic data provided only partial clues. The chemical signatures were faint, inconsistent, and frustratingly ambiguous. Some wavelengths suggested carbon-rich compounds. Others hinted at silicates. A few hinted at metals in ratios that were unusual for natural objects but not impossible. It created a scientific puzzle with no clear solution. The problem wasn't that the data was contradictory. The problem was that the object's surface seemed to reveal only what it allowed to be revealed, responding to sunlight in a way that made surface analysis harder instead of easier. Still, the lack of clarity didn't stop speculation from spreading inside research labs. If the object was natural, it would be one of the rarest and most unusual bodies ever documented. If it was artificial, the implications were enormous, and nobody wanted to say the part out loud. The thought lingered anyway, unspoken but heavy, as if everyone shared the same uncomfortable suspicion while pretending not to. One factor complicated everything further. The object appeared structurally intact despite its violent journey. Structures that survive interstellar travel typically show stress fractures or asymmetry caused by micrometeoroid impacts and radiation exposure. Yet this object reflected radar in a way that suggested uniform density. A few researchers theorized that the uniformity meant extreme age, combined with an unknown preservation process. Others suggested that the object might possess internal reinforcement again, a phrase that hinted at the artificial without explicitly naming it. The more the evidence accumulated, the less comfort the natural explanation provided. Nature can be strange, but it rarely produces perfection. The object's behavior, its consistency, and its resilience all pointed towards something that nature either rarely produces or never produces at all. But the scientific community wasn't ready to state that directly, so they continued dancing around the implications with language that felt increasingly inadequate. At the same time, global health organizations conducted simulations to explore the biological implications of a close pass or impact. These simulations weren't fear-mongering, they were standard procedure. But the results produced scenarios that range from harmless to catastrophic, depending on one factor: whether the object carried organic particles capable of interacting with Earth's atmosphere. Even though interstellar radiation should sterilize all known forms of life, the mere possibility of biological material created a layer of risk that institutions struggled to manage. Publicly, of course, this topic was off limits. Mentioning it would spark chaos across every digital platform within minutes. But behind closed doors, the topic of contamination risk resurfaced often, not in dramatic alien microbe terms, but in scientifically grounded concerns. Unknown organics, if present, could interfere with atmospheric chemistry, alter cloud formation, or in extremely unlikely cases, introduce biochemical variables that Earth had never encountered. Nobody believed a catastrophic biological event was probable, but probabilities don't erase responsibilities, especially when dealing with something humanity has never seen before. Meanwhile, the object continued to behave with the same unsettling stability, forcing analysts to question assumptions they once considered foundational. Everything about its movement suggested control without evidence of propulsion. Everything about its structure suggested resilience without evidence of shielding. Everything about its composition suggested complexity without evidence of decay. It was a contradiction in motion, a quiet riddle slicing through space with composure that made even seasoned experts uneasy. The more scientists reviewed the data, the more they noticed something quietly disturbing. The object wasn't just surviving the hell of interstellar space, it appeared almost indifferent to it. That indifference was interpreted as strength, and strength in this context was terrifying. It meant that whatever the object was, it could traverse the galaxy without falling apart. It meant that cosmic violence wasn't violence to it. It meant endurance on a scale that made Earth feel fragile in comparison. At this point, conversations at research centres shifted from what if to what does this mean? It wasn't simply a matter of survival. It was a matter of what kind of universe humanity lived in. A universe where interstellar objects wander unpredictably is one thing. A universe where something can endure millions of years without degradation is something else entirely. That kind of universe is less comforting, less random, and far more intimidating. Emergency planners, already stressed by the need to prepare for unknown physical threats, now had to incorporate the possibility that the object's composition could behave unpredictably upon entry. If entry happened at all, would it fragment? Would it vaporize? Would it remain intact? Would its internal structure interact differently with Earth's atmosphere than expected? Simulations offered contradicting answers. Some models suggested it would break apart like any other rocky body. Others predicted unexpected resilience. None provided certainty. And looming above these questions was the 19th of December, a date that no longer symbolized potential catastrophe, but potential revelation. Humanity was approaching a moment when theory would collide with reality, and whatever the object was would either pass by harmlessly or reveal something about the universe that could reshape centuries of scientific assumptions. The fear, at this stage, wasn't just about the physical danger, it was about the conceptual danger. If the object survived interstellar travel intact, then humanity wasn't dealing with a simple cosmic visitor. It was confronting the possibility that the universe contains materials, structures, or engineering principles that humanity has never considered. That idea, for scientists, was almost as disturbing as the possibility of impact. As the next phase unfolds, the narrative shifts from what the object might be to what it might imply. Not just for safety, but for everything humanity thought it understood about planets, systems, and what can survive the infinite dark between the stars. And if you think the composition question is unsettling, wait until we examine the signals, the patterns, and the implications that forced entire institutions to reconsider whether this object was simply passing through or observing. As scientists dug deeper into the object's composition and impossible resilience, another development began creeping into their discussions, one they handled with even more caution than the question of organic material. It started with faint, inconsistent data points that most researchers initially dismissed as noise. Small fluctuations in the background readings, subtle distortions in radio sweeps that shouldn't have been there, tiny drops in signal clarity that appeared only when scanning the object and vanished the moment instruments shifted away. None of this looked meaningful at first, but small patterns have a habit of revealing themselves when examined in the right sequence. The first real suspicion emerged when multiple observatories reported the same anomaly, a tiny, repeating disruption in the radio spectrum whenever their sensors aligned precisely with the object's path. These disruptions were not strong enough to be signals, not structured enough to be communication, and not chaotic enough to be background noise. Instead, they sat in a strange middle ground, too regular to ignore, too faint to interpret, and too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The scientific community hates unexplained regularity, because regularity usually implies intent, and intent is not something you want from an unknown object drifting toward your planet. At first, labs attempted to explain the anomaly using natural phenomena. Maybe the object had an unusual surface texture. Maybe it was reflecting solar radiation in a way that interfered with instruments. Maybe cosmic rays were interacting with its structure differently than expected. All reasonable suggestions, and all proven insufficient once the data sets overlapped. The disruptions weren't random, they were synchronized. And synchronization, even in the mildest sense, implies a relationship between the object and the measuring systems observing it. Nobody dared to call it a signal, but nobody could call it noise anymore either. This ambiguity sparked dozens of internal debates. Most scientists refused to jump to conclusions, insisting it was irresponsible to attach meaning to patterns that might vanish with more thorough analysis. Others argued that ignoring those patterns was equally irresponsible, especially when the object's behavior already defied every natural category in the database. Meanwhile, institutional leaders stepped very carefully around the issue, terrified of stoking panic or fueling conspiracy theories. The last thing they wanted was half the planet believing an alien transmission had arrived based solely on a few unexplained measurements. But the measurements kept coming. The more observatories coordinated their readings, the clearer the pattern became. The fluctuations occurred only when the object was being directly observed and only within specific frequency bands. It was as if the object interacted differently with instruments depending on how closely it was being watched. That concept alone felt absurd, offensive even, to traditional scientific sensibilities. Yet the data refused to bend. The anomaly was real, and it wasn't going away. Eventually, a small group of analysts performed a long-duration correlation test, comparing fluctuations from multiple stations around the world. The result unsettled even the most skeptical researchers. The distortions lined up too perfectly. Different instruments, different locations, different atmospheric conditions, and yet the pattern repeated. Weak, faint, inconsistent, but undeniably deliberate in its rhythm. Not a message, but something analogous to a heartbeat. Something that suggested internal processes rather than random chance. This forced scientists to confront an uncomfortable question. If the object wasn't sending a signal, was it still emitting something meaningful simply by existing? Could its structure, rotation, or internal mechanisms, assuming such mechanisms existed, produce patterns that looked intentional without being intentionally transmitted? The debate didn't produce a satisfying conclusion, only more speculation layered on speculation. As the discussions continued, a deeper concern emerged. The anomaly wasn't just synchronized across observatories, it was evolving. Slight variations appeared over time, growing more pronounced as the object moved closer. The patterns were still faint, still ambiguous, but no longer static. They shifted with a complexity that natural bodies do not produce. Even cometary outgassing, known for unpredictability, follows chemical and thermal processes that can be modelled. This object did not behave like chemistry. It behaved like something adjusting to circumstances. That realization spread quietly among certain groups of researchers, though none dared to state it formally. If the anomaly evolved with proximity, then the object's behavior was not only stable but responsive, and responsiveness as a property tends to imply awareness, if not in the conscious sense, then in the systemic sense. A sensor responds, a machine responds, a designed structure responds. Random rocks drifting through space do not. Still, without hard evidence, the official line remained cautious. This was not a signal, not communication, not intention, merely an observation-dependent variable anomaly. A phrase designed to calm nobody and explain nothing. But bureaucratic language was the only shield institutions had against the growing dread that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. As the object approached, the distortions deepened further, and they began affecting slightly wider frequency ranges. Nothing dangerous, but enough to attract attention from military systems that monitor satellite communication integrity. Suddenly, the issue was no longer confined to astronomers. Now, defense agencies were asking questions too, questions that carried a sharper edge. If the object was emitting something detectable, even unintentionally, could it interfere with orbital systems? Could it disrupt communication networks? Could it cause misreadings in radar systems or GPS drift? These questions weren't about panic, they were about operational risk, and operational risk demands preparation. The more agencies monitored the object, the more apparent it became that the distortions weren't a threat but a signature. Something akin to a fingerprint generated by the object's properties, a fingerprint that humanity had never seen before. Scientists began comparing the anomaly to known cosmic phenomena, searching for any precedent. Black holes, neutron stars, magnetars, powerhouses of the cosmos emit far more dramatic signals, but none match the faint shifting pattern detected here. The anomaly was too weak for those comparisons and too structured for natural explanations. Meanwhile, speculation began forming in quiet corners of research centres. The idea that the object might contain internal compartments. The idea that it might possess some form of preservation or reinforcement. The idea that it wasn't simply a rock drifting through space, but something far more complex, perhaps even something that once served a purpose. These ideas were dangerous, not because they were far-fetched, but because they were increasingly difficult to disprove. Even the skeptics found themselves uneasy. Every new measurement added more questions and removed none. The object wasn't behaving like a probe, it wasn't broadcasting structured communication, or altering its trajectory explicitly. But it wasn't behaving like debris either. It existed in the uncanny valley between lifeless object and engineered artifact, a place where categories break down and uncertainty thrives. By now, institutions knew they were walking blind into a situation that demanded answers. But the 19th was coming, the object was approaching, and the timeline for understanding was shrinking. The distortions were not strong enough to cause harm, yet their existence alone implied that the object's internal state was far from simplistic. Something was happening within it, something measurable, something evolving, something that didn't match known physical behaviour. And while scientists tried to maintain calm professionalism, the reality weighed on them heavily. If the object carried a signal, humanity lacked the resolution to decode it. If it carried no signal, then the patterns were a byproduct of a structure too advanced or too alien for our current models. Either way, the conclusion was the same. Humanity was observing an object that defied classification. As we move forward, the question shifts from what the object emits to how the planet responds. Because whether or not the object intends anything, its presence alone has forced humanity to confront possibilities it spent generations avoiding. And the closer it gets, the louder those possibilities become. The closer the object came, the more intensely humanity projected meaning onto it. People have a remarkable talent for turning the unknown into a mirror, reflecting their own fears, hopes, and narratives, whether or not those narratives have any grounding in reality. Some interpreted the object as a warning, others as a test, others as punishment, and a few as an opportunity for cosmic contact. But institutions, scrambling to maintain structure, found themselves wrestling with an entirely different burden. The burden of what history had left behind. Across numerous countries, intelligence communities quietly pulled old documents from archives files that hadn't been touched for decades, sometimes generations. Reports from the early space age, declassified notes from Cold War observatories, handwritten logs from long-retired astronomers who had recorded anomalies they never had the technology to investigate. The world had a habit of forgetting moments when the sky behaved strangely, but intelligence agencies never forget. They keep everything, even the things that once seemed absurd or irrelevant. Most of these files contain nothing but unsolved mysteries, brief flashes of unexplained light, radar tracks dismissed as atmospheric interference, rumours of distant objects that change brightness in ways no one could explain. Individually, these anomalies meant nothing, but collectively they painted an uncomfortable picture. The universe had thrown oddities at humanity before, and humanity had mostly shrugged, filed them away and moved on. Now, with a potentially dangerous visitor approaching, those forgotten moments resurfaced with a different sting. Maybe they weren't meaningless. Maybe nobody had been paying enough attention. This realization deepened the tension among intelligence agencies. Some argued that these historical anomalies provided context, that the current object was part of a pattern humanity had never recognized. Others dismissed the files as coincidence piled on coincidence, warning that drawing connections where none existed would only amplify confusion. The debates were sharp, private, and often unproductive, but they revealed something important. Institutions were not just reacting to a threat, they were reacting to the uncomfortable possibility that humanity had missed clues before. While analysts dug through the past, another group examined cultural records, myths, legends, ancient descriptions of strange lights crossing the sky. Civilizations had a long tradition of explaining celestial oddities through metaphor, and while most of those stories held no scientific value, some contained details uncomfortably similar to the behavior of the approaching object. Again, nothing conclusive, just patterns that invited uneasy reflection. Humans have always looked upward and wondered. Maybe they had seen more than they understood. None of this meant the object was connected to ancient events, but it added pressure to institutions already struggling to maintain composure. People expect governments to have answers. They expect scientists to be certain. They expect intelligence agencies to operate with confidence. But confidence requires understanding, and the object offered none. As historical and cultural fragments resurfaced, agencies faced a choice: ignore them, risking the appearance of negligence if they later proved relevant, or consider them, risking ridicule for engaging with speculation. Most chose a middle path, They quietly analysed everything, but publicly acknowledged nothing. That duality created a strange dynamic where truth-seeking and fear of embarrassment existed side by side. The strangest consequence of this archival digging was not the historical anomalies, it was the psychological effect on those reviewing them. When intelligent people spend enough time reading about generations of unexplained sightings and unresolved patterns, their perception begins to bend. They stop asking if the approaching object is part of something larger, and start asking why they are suddenly entertaining questions they would have dismissed 6 months earlier. This shift in mindset is dangerous because it blurs the line between caution and paranoia. But it's also inevitable when confronting an anomaly that refuses to fit into any known category. Meanwhile, as institutions examined the past, society clung to the present. People consumed updates obsessively, even when the update said nothing new. Rumours spread faster than corrections. Every vague phrase from a government official generated hours of online speculation, and speculation in turn fed back into institutional decision-making, because agencies had to consider the public mood as carefully as they considered the object's trajectory. If panic grew too quickly, even harmless updates could destabilise regions. This feedback loop of perception versus reality made communication nearly impossible. When authorities spoke cautiously, people accused them of hiding the truth. When authorities spoke confidently, people accused them of underestimating the danger. No message satisfied everyone. No tone felt appropriate. Even silence carried dangerous meaning, because silence encourages imagination, and imagination gravitates toward the worst-case scenario. Inside this chaos, intelligence analysts began noticing something peculiar. The object's presence seemed to amplify pre-existing tensions on Earth. Not directly, of course. It wasn't broadcasting psychological waves or influencing minds, but its arrival acted like a catalyst, exposing fractures in society that had always been there but never fully revealed. Mistrust in institutions, fragmented information ecosystems, competing belief systems, unequal access to knowledge. The object didn't create these problems. It simply illuminated them by forcing everyone to confront the same uncertainty at the same time. That was the real danger institutions feared. Not the object itself, but the societal unravelling it could trigger if mishandled. A civilization that fractures under the pressure of uncertainty is vulnerable long before any physical threat arrives. And as agencies compared global patterns, they realised something chilling. Humanity was already fracturing, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. This realisation pushed some governments to explore deeper, more speculative questions. If the object wasn't natural, then what would its purpose be? Observation, communication, transportation, catastrophe, migration? These questions were asked privately, carefully, and often reluctantly. Nobody wanted to be the first official to suggest the object might have intent. Intent implies intelligence. Intelligence implies design. And design implies a universe far more complicated than humanity had prepared for. Still, the idea lingered. It lingered because the object's behaviour encouraged it. Its silent approach, its structural resilience, its evolving radio distortions, its refusal to behave like anything familiar. Even the skeptics committed to natural explanations found themselves running out of natural explanations to offer, and then came the moment that changed everything. Not because the object did something dramatic, but because it did something small. It passed through a region of space where gravitational interactions should have altered its trajectory, even slightly. But instead of drifting or adjusting, it continued exactly as predicted, cutting through the gravitational field like a knife passing through water. No resistance, no wobble, no measurable effect. That single moment shattered the last illusions of predictability. The object wasn't just unusual, it was impossible under known physics, and impossible phenomena do not arrive without reason. As this realization spread quietly among scientists and intelligence communities, another quiet fear settled in. The fear that humanity might not be encountering a random visitor, but a returning phenomenon. Something that had happened before, unnoticed or misunderstood. Something woven into the forgotten pages of history. Something that civilizations had tried to describe long before the vocabulary of physics existed. But whether the object represented continuity or coincidence meant nothing now. It was approaching, it was indifferent, and its trajectory remained a question that humanity could no longer ignore. In the next part, the tone shifts once again from interpreting meaning to confronting possibility. Because once the past is excavated and the present is destabilized, the final question becomes the most frightening of all. What happens if the object has a purpose and humanity is simply the last to understand it? As institutions struggled to interpret history and the public wrestled with uncertainty, the scientific community began moving toward a question they had avoided until the last possible moment. It wasn't about what the object was made of or how long it had travelled or why its movement was unnaturally perfect. The deeper question, the one nobody wanted to articulate, was what the object might be doing. This wasn't speculation about intent in the dramatic sci-fi sense. Nobody was talking about invasion plans or hidden messages. The concern was far more subtle and far more unsettling. What if the object was following a scenario of its own? Scientists rely on models to predict behaviour models of gravity, light, motion, decay. When something doesn't fit the model gets updated. That's how science works. But the object broke models faster than new ones could be drafted. It behaved like a problem designed to resist solution, adapting just enough to remain stable, but never enough to reveal its true nature. This forced researchers into a mindset they were deeply uncomfortable with, treating the object not as a random event, but as a system with its own internal logic. The first sign of this shift came when analysts compared predicted trajectories over time. Normally, predictions become more accurate with each new measurement, but with this object, predictions improved only up to a certain point and then plateaued, refusing to converge. It was as if the object moved according to a pattern that calculations could approximate but never fully capture. This caused a quiet panic among orbital specialists. When a model stops improving, it usually means the model is incomplete. When it refuses to improve despite massive data input, it means the phenomenon may not be bound to the assumptions the model is built on. This realization forced scientists to consider a scenario that had been floating beneath the surface since the beginning. What if the object's path was not simply the result of physical forces? What if it represented an internal decision process? Again, not conscious decision-making. Nobody was claiming intelligence, but systematic behavior. Something more structured than gravity, more deliberate than randomness. The scientific term would be non-gravitational driver, but even that felt insufficient for what they were observing. As researchers debated this possibility, a new layer of complexity surfaced. The probability models used to predict the object's behavior began showing patterns that resembled decision trees. This wasn't intentional design, it was mathematics trying to adapt to unfamiliar data, but it made the implications unavoidable. The object's trajectory didn't follow a single predictable curve. It followed something closer to a branching structure, multiple potential paths weighted by variables scientists couldn't identify. And the worst part was that these branches were not shaped by Earth's gravity or solar radiation. They seemed shaped by something internal to the object. This sparked frantic discussions. If the object's behavior reflected scenario modeling, then what were those scenarios based on? What inputs shaped the branching? Were they environmental, structural, algorithmic? Theories multiplied quickly, ranging from the very grounded, rotational mass cycling, to the extremely speculative, internal decision logic. None could be disproven. Meanwhile, real-world pressure intensified. As the 19th approached, scientists felt the burden of uncertainty more heavily than ever. The public wanted reassurance, governments wanted clarity, intelligence agencies wanted explanations, and scientists had nothing but fragments of theory stitched together with disclaimers. Every press briefing became a negotiation between admitting ignorance and preventing panic. Nobody was satisfied with the messaging, least of all the people delivering it. The deeper researchers went into the data, the more disturbing the patterns became. The object wasn't just approaching Earth, it was approaching Earth in a way that implied tolerance for minor deviations. Natural bodies are sensitive to gravitational perturbations. Even slight shifts in mass distribution can cause wobble or drift. But this object behaved as if gravitational fluctuations were irrelevant, as if it accounted for them automatically or filtered them out altogether. That kind of filtering suggested an internal stabilizing mechanism, something that allowed the object to maintain its path regardless of environmental noise. This realization led to a terrifying question. If the object was capable of ignoring or compensating for gravitational disturbances, then what environmental factor would cause it to change course? Did such a factor exist? Or was the path fixed from the moment it entered the solar system, predetermined by something humanity would never comprehend? The implications tied knots in the minds of those studying it. At the same time, a different kind of analysis emerged, one that focused not on the object itself, but on humanity's response. Behavioral scientists began tracking global emotional patterns, noticing that the object's consistent approach created cycles of anxiety, denial, humour, frustration, and resignation. What concerned them wasn't the fear itself, but the predictability of the fear. They noticed that public sentiment oscillated in waves, almost synchronised with major trajectory updates. Every time uncertainty increased, panic spiked. Every time uncertainty decreased, complacency grew. Humanity as a whole began behaving like a reactive system responding to the object's slow, steady approach. This observation sparked a chilling thought in certain academic circles. If humans reacted predictably to the object, could the object's path be interacting with those reactions in ways nobody had considered? Not intentionally, but structurally. The idea wasn't that the object was studying humanity, but that humanity was unknowingly participating in the scenario modelling by projecting predictable behaviour onto an unpredictable event. In simpler terms, the object created uncertainty, and the uncertainty created human reactions, and those reactions altered how institutions prepared, analysed, and interpreted the object. The situation became a feedback loop. The scientific method depends on observation without interference, but humanity cannot observe without reacting, and reaction, at scale, can change outcomes. This caused some researchers to ask uncomfortable questions about whether humanity was altering the scenario simply by existing inside it. All of this led to a heavier, darker question, one that surfaced in private meetings but rarely in public discussions. If the object followed scenario patterns, then what scenarios did it model? Impact, close pass, atmospheric entry, encounter, observation? None provided a satisfying answer because all were rooted in assumptions humanity might not be qualified to make. But one possibility, an unspoken one, began creeping through the conversations of those who had spent the longest time looking at the data. What if the object wasn't acting according to its own scenario, but according to a scenario imposed on it long ago? Something ancient, something programmed or shaped before humanity ever existed, something travelling for so long that the original purpose had faded, leaving only the mechanisms behind. This idea was not comforting. It didn't make the object any safer. If anything, it raised more questions. A relic with unknown purpose could be as dangerous as a deliberate probe. It could be benign. It could be dormant. It could be malfunctioning. It could be fulfilling an instruction whose meaning had been lost to time. And yet, this possibility fit the data better than any natural object hypothesis. A natural object does not carry scenario structures. A natural object does not maintain perfect stability. A natural object does not defy environmental influence. Something made does. Something designed does. Something following an ancient directive does. But acknowledging this interpretation publicly was impossible. Institutions couldn't say, "We might be dealing with an artifact without triggering global panic." Scientists couldn't say it without destroying credibility. Intelligence agencies couldn't say it without rewriting geopolitics. So the idea became a silent conclusion, one shared quietly, cautiously, among those who understood the data well enough to see what it implied. Meanwhile, the 19th continued approaching with the slow inevitability of a clock that refuses to stop ticking. The closer it came, the clearer it became that whatever the object was, it carried meaning. Maybe not meaning for humanity specifically, but meaning within the vast, indifferent architecture of the universe. In the next phase, the story shifts from scenario interpretation to the final emotional and practical preparation. Because when an unknown object continues its deliberate path toward your planet, there comes a moment when humanity must stop analysing possibilities and confront the truth that has hovered beneath every update. The universe might be about to reveal something extraordinary, and humanity has no choice but to witness it. As the 19th approached, a strange quietness settled over every institution, every research facility, Every government office and every individual who had been following the data closely enough to understand what it meant, the chaos of speculation, the frantic modelling, the desperate search for answers, everything slowed, not because clarity had arrived, but because the reality finally became too large to outrun. Humanity had reached the point where analysing the objects no longer mattered. The object was coming regardless of what anyone believed about it, and the only thing left was to face whatever the universe had prepared. For the scientists who had been working for months under crushing uncertainty, this phase felt like walking through a corridor whose walls steadily narrowed. Every new measurement confirmed what the previous ones implied. The object was not adjusting its path, and Earth would soon witness either a harmless passage or a catastrophic introduction to something beyond human understanding. But acceptance does strange things to the mind. Once the shock fades and the denial dissolves, a kind of calm resignation appears, an emotional flatline that allows researchers to continue doing their jobs even as their work brushes against existential edges. This calm wasn't peace. Peace requires safety. This was simply the absence of panic. Something like the quiet before anesthesia, when your body understands that whatever happens next will be out of your hands entirely. Emergency planners, who had spent weeks preparing for dozens of drastically different scenarios, entered a similar mental state. They stopped arguing over probabilities. They stopped pushing for models that contradicted one another. They simply made their final checks, reviewed their contingency frameworks, and accepted the inherent limits of their work. You cannot prepare a planet for something you don't understand. You can only prepare the parts of the planet you can reach. And every institution reached its limit long before certainty arrived. In the public sphere, tension took on an entirely different form. After weeks of fluctuating emotional waves, fear, denial, humour, fatalism, people settled into a rhythm of uneasy waiting. Some filled their time with dark jokes, some turned philosophical. Some called loved ones they hadn't spoken to in years. Some decided nothing mattered anymore and acted accordingly. Society fractured into thousands of coping strategies, each one rooted in the same uncomfortable truth. Humans have never been good at waiting for answers that determine their survival. Despite everything, life continued in its strange half-normality. People still bought groceries, still complained about traffic, still argued online about unrelated topics, as if clinging to routine could anchor reality in place. That illusion mattered more than most would admit. Routine is comfort, routine is identity, and routine is the last shield against the realization that the world might be standing on the edge of something extraordinary or irreversible. Meanwhile, astronomers monitored the object with increasing intensity as it entered the final measurable segment of its approach. The closer it came, the more detailed the readings became, and the stranger the details looked. Surface reflections showed no clear texture. Radar mapping bounced back uniform density profiles. Infrared imaging revealed temperature readings that refused to correlate with expected material composition. The object maintained a stability that bordered on absurd. It did not spin irregularly, it did not fracture, it did not react to thermal stress. It simply continued, unaffected, indifferent, precise. This precision scared experts more than the possibility of impact. Precision meant purpose, and purpose in a cosmic object suggested mechanisms far beyond natural randomness. A small subset of researchers whispered a theory that most were unwilling to support publicly. The object might not be awake in any meaningful sense, but it might not be entirely dormant either. Something travelling for unimaginable distances might operate on timescales humanity cannot comprehend. A system that activates only under certain conditions. A structure that responds only when proximity thresholds are met. A relic that does not seek, but simply fulfills a function assigned long before human civilization existed. A visitor not guided by intention, but by ancient design. This line of thinking was deeply unsettling, because it placed humanity not at the centre of the event, but accidentally within its path. If the object followed an ancient instruction, then Earth's proximity was either an irrelevance or part of a schedule older than recorded history. And neither option made anyone feel safer. Across intelligence communities, the tone shifted once again. No longer were analysts trying to understand the object's origin. They were trying to determine whether humanity played any role at all in the scenario unfolding. Was this an encounter or merely an intersection? Was Earth the subject or the bystander? Those questions offered no practical value, but they shaped the emotional reality of the situation. If humanity was merely in the way, the outcome depended entirely on physics. If humanity was the focus, the outcome depended on something else. Something unpredictable. Something that could not be modelled. Something that might not consider human existence relevant. The final approach, in the days leading to the 19th, felt unreal. Telescopes captured the object's sharp silhouette as it crossed the last gap between cosmic distance and planetary relevance. Social media overflowed with anxious commentary, hopeful speculation, and apocalyptic humour. News broadcasts updated the public in careful tones that tried to balance transparency with calmness. Streets filled with people pretending to live normally, while billions of private thoughts drifted toward the same unspoken question. What happens when the unknown becomes present? And then came the last updates from observation stations. The object was on track. No deviation, no unexpected acceleration, no atmospheric interaction yet. Everything remained within the same narrow margin of possibility it had carried from the beginning, just stable enough to offer hope, just unpredictable enough to sustain fear. Scientists watched the final data streams with the quiet intensity of people witnessing something historic, uncertain whether it would become a miracle or a tragedy. The anticipation was overwhelming, not because an answer was coming, but because waiting was finally ending. Humans can handle impact or survival. They struggle with uncertainty, and the 19th promised an end to uncertainty, one way or another. In those final hours, every layer of society, scientific, institutional, public held its breath metaphorically, even if nobody admitted it out loud. It wasn't ceremony, it wasn't collective unity, it was simply the human mind bracing for whatever the universe had decided to reveal, and the universe, silent as always, offered no reassurance. The truth that finally settled across humanity was strangely humbling. We had reached the limit of knowledge, the limit of preparation, the limit of prediction. For all our telescopes, computers, equations, theories and simulations, the final outcome was no longer in our hands. It belonged to physics, probability, and whatever secrets the object carried within its silent, perfect structure. And therein lay the last unspoken thought one that unified fear and fascination in equal measure. No matter what happened, the 19th of December would end one story and begin another. A story in which humanity either learned that the universe was far more survivable than it looked, or far less forgiving. Either way, the waiting was almost over.